Dear Remedy Games, okay, I'm sorry, but I didn't play Control until like just now. Seriously, my best friend, hi Mike, has been bugging me to play this game for the past, let me check my calendar here, 2 freaking years, and I finally got around to it, and wow, I love this game! That's not what this video is about, though. Oh, also, if you've not played Control or haven't beaten it, like, do not watch this video. Seriously, I talk about, like, the biggest spoilers in the game. I'm not kidding. It's, like, the main plot point and all the reveals, so, go play it and come back here when you're done, or, I don't know, keep watching, I can't stop you, but you're not allowed to complain about spoilers if you keep going. Anyway, when I played Control, I knew I was gonna have to do a video on it, and then the more I played, I was like, how on earth do I do a video on this? Because my entire show is about science, math, things are at least slightly empirical, and Control is pretty much the opposite of that. Even more than some magical fantasy worlds, this game intentionally stands in stark opposition to the material realities of our universe and pronounces them to be real. What am I supposed to do with that? The entire game is wearing science-proof armor that my laser-focused science vision can't penetrate. But then I thought of something interesting, something new. As loyal fans of the show know, typically my show has a pretty standard formula. Thing happens in game, thing is implausible, find a relevant formula, plug in the variables, hit enter, and oh my stars, it makes no sense! Sometimes I dabble in good things actually bad, or the secret dark truth stuff, and that is a fun format. I love it, but sometimes, on some days, I like to do something a little different. Something that broadens your understanding of the game and the world around you, not nitpicking, not tearing down, but building up, enriching and teaching you something truly special. And today is one of those weird days. Join me as we examine my personal favorite fan theory for Control and prove it using science. I'm not gonna bury the lead here. This is it. Dylan and Jesse Faden aren't brother and sister, they're the same person. Let's go. Before we go any further, let's go over the basics first for those of you who haven't played the game in a while, just breeze through for the combat, or for some reason don't care about spoilers and are still here. I have to say that explaining Control to someone who hasn't played it can be incredibly funny, and it is an enormously difficult game to spoil. In Control, you play as an adult woman named Jesse Faden. Jesse grew up in the small town of Ordinary, Maine in late 2002. As a child, Jesse discovered an incredibly powerful item in the garbage dump on the outskirts of town where she and other kids used to play. Something called an object of power. This object of power was a slide projector. It was just a normal slide projector, save for the small fact that it was capable of producing gateways into alternate dimensions. Inside one of these dimensions, Jesse discovered a life form of some kind, a powerful, extra-dimensional, resonance-based life form. They became friends. Eventually, after exploring the projector for quite a while, some stuff that isn't super important happened. All the adults living in an ordinary disappeared, and Jesse burned all the slides for the projector, save for one. Slidescape 36, the hand. Enter the Federal Bureau of Control, a United States institution that specifically exists to govern, contain, and control altered world events, the term that they use for large-scale paranormal incidents. It's basically the X-Files if it wasn't just one dubious guy in a single office and instead it had the funding of the entire FBI. The events of Ordinary Maine were an altered world event, or AWE for short, as were the events of Alan Wake at Cauldron Lake in Bright Falls, Washington. The FBC detected this AWE in Ordinary and showed up to do #government stuff and took Dylan Faden, Jesse's younger brother, into custody, as well as the slide projector and the entire garbage dump. But Jesse got away. Fast forward 17 years, it's the start of the game, and Jesse Faden is at the steps leading into the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Control at 33 Thomas Street, New York, searching for her brother, Dylan. She steps inside, explores a bit, meets a cool janitor, and goes upstairs and meets the director of the FBC, well, she would have if he had not come down with a slightly fatal case of being shot. She picks up a magic gun, talks to a pyramid, and just like that, she's the new director of the FBC. Just in time, too, because the building has been overrun by some sort of sentient, resonance-based sound monster called the Hiss, which is possessing people left and right and might take over the world. You know, your standard Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Men in Black stuff. There's always a Carillion death ray, or an intergalactic plague, or a sentient Lovecraftian sound monster that is about to wipe out all life on this miserable little planet. Jessie goes around using her magic powers and magic gun to defeat the Hiss, learning telekinesis from a floppy disk, learning how to fly from a TV set. You know, all the basics. All the while, she's looking for Dylan, her brother. She finds him, he's possessed by the Hiss, yada yada. She finds the projector, which is leaking the Hiss into our reality, shuts it down, her brother goes into a coma, there's a DLC with Alan Wake and a big rock, and it's great. Phew! Okay, that's the basic summary of the events in Control and the events leading up to it. Just a recap. You good? I'm good. Don't take your eyes off the fridge, though. We're just about to start in with the really weird stuff. We need to back up a little bit. Near the end of the second act of the game, at the beginning of the My Brother's Keeper mission, you're finally able to come face to face with Jessie's long-lost brother, Dylan Faden, and finally get to talk. Dylan is possessed by the Hiss like many others, but because of his unusual para-utilitarian powers, he is immune to a degree to the full takeover that every other victim in the entire game is experiencing. As a result, you can talk to him, sort of. You only have to talk to him once, but you can talk to him a total of 6 times, during the final 5 of which Dylan tells you about dreams of his. They're all kind of weird and make only a little bit of sense, but when you know the context of the dreams, they actually make a lot of sense. In dream number 4, the one about Mr. Dorr, Dylan describes seeing a writer who wrote a story about a cop and that in another world, the cop was real. This is referencing Alan Wake and Max Payne. One actually takes place in the Remedyverse, and the other is just another title made by Remedy. Possibly Quantum Break is also referenced, but I'm not confident about that one. In the final dream, Dylan describes dreaming the scene that is actually happening, him talking to Jessie, the exact words that he's saying. Dream 2 is incredibly interesting because it foreshadows events that will actually happen to Jessie later in the game when the Hiss attempts to possess her and makes her experience a nightmare where she's just an office assistant doing ordinary, mundane, boring tasks while Dylan is the director. All the dreams he recalls have one thing in common. They're all true. Sort of. The one about the Hiss taking over the planet through the President of the United States is suspect, but it's definitely still possible by the end of the events of Control. The Hiss isn't destroyed, it's just temporarily contained, and Dylan could still release it if he wanted, if he ever wakes up. Why is this important? Because of the one dream that I skipped, the one that I didn't talk about, dream number 1. And you know what, actually, I'm gonna let Dylan take it from here.
I'd like to tell you about a dream I had last night. I was back in Ordinary before all of this happened, but in the dream, I was alone. It was just me. I was the only child, a girl. My name was Jessie Dylan Faden. Have you ever noticed that our names, Jessie, Dylan, they could be girls' names, boys' names, could be anything. Don't you find that weird? I find that weird.
And this dream is the key to unlocking the real mystery of Control. Well, aside for who or what Ati the janitor is. You up for that one, Matt? Anyway, the mystery to me is what really happened in Ordinary Maine. And this dream tells us all that we need to know. Dylan was created by Jessie using the slide projector, and the birth of Dylan Faden is the true altered world event that took place in Ordinary Maine. And the key to unlocking this mystery resides solidly within my wheelhouse, the realm of science, and it all begins with one guy, a Swiss psychologist named Carl Jung. Jung is controversial for a lot of the same reasons Freud is, and in spite of his insistence to the contrary, Jung really does work within a very similar framework to Freud's. That being said, the criticisms of his applicability in modern clinical settings don't actually matter here at all. Like, at all. And this is because the world of control presupposes that the rules of Carl Jung's analytical psychology are empirically true, and they govern the entire world of control. In fact, it turns out that there's several scraps of lore that state this outright with no subtlety whatsoever, but even if you miss these papers in-game, there's dozens, maybe even hundreds of hints to Jung being an influencer of the metaphysics of control. Carl Jung, for the uninitiated, was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who was born in the late 19th century. For a while, he was mentored by Freud, who saw him as a sort of heir to his field, but Jung eventually developed a different branch of psychology, analytical psychology. He came up with a lot of foundational ideas that are actually still in use today. His biggest ideas were individuation and the different layers of consciousness and the psyche, specifically consciousness, personal unconsciousness, and collective unconsciousness. These different consciousnesses are moderated by the ego, which is a sort of psychological triage, which ideas and experiences get filed into the conscious and unconscious. According to Jung, all these different elements of the psyche interacted with each other in incredibly complex and difficult to predict ways. Jung also espoused dream analysis and complexes and symbols and rituals, and he definitely believed in the paranormal, so there's a lot of relevance between his work and control. In fact, it wasn't even those direct scraps of lore that specifically mention Jung that got me on this path. Rather, it was a video by Dr. Casper Darling that played. I think it was in the research division, and it was on altered world events. In this video, he says that altered world events are attracted to archetypal objects, an idea of Jung's, influenced by the collective unconscious, another idea of Jung's, and it's related to dreams, another idea of Jung's. I could go on forever. There's literally too much to go over. Jung was tremendously prolific. So for the purposes of this video and proving that Dylan, while real, wasn't really Jesse's brother born of her parents, but instead was the result of the AWE in Ordinary, we're going to be focusing on two core concepts of the personal unconscious from Jung's work: the shadow and the animus and the anima. The animus and anima are pretty simple to understand. In Jung's analysis of the human psyche, which I cannot stress enough is from the early 20th century, he proposed that all humans have two binary gender influences in their subconscious. Men have the anima, a feminine voice or personality, let's say, and women have the animus, the same thing but masculine. Pretty simple to grasp, right? The shadow, meanwhile, it's a little bit more complicated. The shadow is reminiscent of Freud's idea of the id. It's a suppressed part of the personal unconscious that the ego is entirely unaware of. With the ego being the main gatekeeper, the persona, this means, in short, that the shadow represents the unknowable parts of us that exist, whether we want them to or not. The shadow sounds menacing, but in Jung's framework, this is not always the case. It's simply the parts of us that are hidden and suppressed. These can very easily be things we or others consider to be positive traits. I mean, think about your own shadow in real life. It's not a malicious force, it's just something created by the blocking of light. It's obscured, but not evil. That said, the shadow within you is instinctive, irrational, and prone to showing up in your dreams. Jungian clinicians make confronting the shadow and bringing elucidation to the darkness to be one of the goals of treatment. By bringing the subconscious to the conscious, you shine a light on it, and it gets smaller. And therefore, something that you don't understand or maybe even know about starts to become less influential on your behavior. If unconfronted, if left to grow, the shadow will get darker and denser, more real, more powerful, more irrational. And as Jung himself said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. Let's talk about Jessie for a bit. Her childhood. We know almost nothing about her childhood in the game. It's all built around this altered world event. But there are some clues. In the game, there are 2 audio recordings, just 2, of Jessie with a therapist. We don't learn a lot about her, and it's easy to dismiss these tapes as irrelevant, that they're just a form of the real world gaslighting Jessie's real experiences with the paranormal, but there's more to it than that, specifically this crucial exchange.
A dump is a place for lost things. Things that have been thrown away. Did you ever feel that way when you were growing up, Jesse?
What? No. Yes, but that has nothing to do with...
It's easy to gloss over this small window we get into the time before the ordinary AWE, but it is crucial to know. Jessie's home life was bad. She felt neglected at the very least. Not just neglected, thrown away, discarded. In fact, in the transcripts from interviews with her and Dylan you can find throughout the game, she practically lived in that dump and had near-death experiences with extremely violent and dangerous bullies. Jessie is a victim of childhood trauma that predates having her brother stolen from her, her parents killed. Trauma from before she was homeless. It was her life. And what's more, the events preceding the disappearance of the adults of Ordinary, of the burning of the slides, of the kidnapping of Dylan, they themselves were violent and traumatic. Jessie was chased by a gang of violent children and a literal monster called the Not Mother. Jessie, to survive in the way she did in a home life that was awful, that made her feel discarded, likely had to push down a lot of things, a lot of emotions. Rage, resentment, fear, impulsiveness, violence, lack of control, need for control. She pushed these things into her shadow. And her shadow grew. And it grew. And at its peak, well... I left something out before about the shadow, and it's kind of important. The shadow, in its unknowability, unseeability, still manifests in a very interesting way when it comes to control in particular. The word Jung used was Schattenprojection. I think that's right. I'm so sorry, Germans. That's literally translated as shadow projection. In psychology, projection means to see a perceived moral failing of yourself in another person, regardless of whether or not it's actually there. Projection. A slide projector. We know that the slide projector is powerful. It's capable of opening up or maybe even creating new dimensions and worlds whole cloth. But what if it's capable of more than that? What if it's not limited to just slides? Jessie, through her actions, triggered an altered world event during the peak of an emotional crisis after nearly dying, living a life of suffering and neglect, her shadow growing until she interacted with a tremendously powerful paranormal object which took something from her, made it real, projected it. In the other therapy recording, Jessie admits to feeling like a part of her is missing. She thinks it's Polaris, but what if it's Dylan? A chunk of her psyche, her animus, the masculine part of her brain, projected into reality, harboring all the manifestations of her shadow archetype. In therapy, these would be confronted and assimilated, but with an object of power capable of creating realities? All bets are off. The slide projector ripped Jessie's rage, instability, impulsiveness, lack of control, and need for independence from her and manifested it in reality with her animus. And then it was taken from her by the government, never to be seen again until the events of Control. There's more lore support for this at the end of Foundation, the board, which frequently uses words or phrases that are contradictory but often synonyms. A being that laces its statements with multiple confused meanings calls Jessie something. Jessie, Dylan, Faden. They know the truth. Dylan knows the truth. At the end of the game, Dylan is in a coma, unresponsive. And why is that? Maybe taking the hiss out of him just ruined him, a lobotomy. Or maybe Jessie, by confronting her rage, her rebellious nature, her impulsiveness, by imposing control on the uncontrollable, made the shadow weaker. And in that, in turn, made Dylan himself weaker. It's hard to say for sure. The shadow isn't inherently evil. Dylan is not inherently evil. It's not malicious. In the Jungian framework, it's just something that exists. A part of us that we can encounter, avoid, merge with, or assimilate. An eventual goal of Jungian treatment is to assimilate with your shadow. It doesn't control you, it doesn't hide, it's just there, in your consciousness, real, making you more whole. Maybe someday Jessie will finally assimilate with her shadow and be whole again. Jessie, Dylan, Faden, maybe in Control too, and I'm not just theory crafting here. I wholly believe that this was the intended subtext of Control, put there on purpose by Sam Lake and his creative team at Remedy. I think the duality of the animus and anima and the importance of the assimilation of the shadow are going to be major plot points in any future story about Jessie and Dylan. I have to give a major shout out to Reddit user L Sunday. I came up with this idea independently originally, but this guy did a lot of digging for lore support, and he's got some really, really cool conclusions about the town of Ordinary itself as well. This guy's write-up saved me a lot of digging around for some of the lore specifics, and I cannot thank him enough. It is a great supplement to this video, and I highly recommend you give his theory, Ordinary Girl, a read. Link is in the description. Sincerely, Austin. P.S. Yes, I did think of Alan Wake and Alan Wake 2 while researching the Shadow archetype, and I don't have time to get into it! I have to throw out a personal thank you to all my patrons who make this show possible, and a special thanks to Marstheman, Miss Kendra, Ronald Coleman, Alan Hagers, AddedMTP, Nicholas Bellinger, Marissa Resnik, Nick Patterson, and Lorretta Mazerf for contributing at the higher levels, and I will see you another time! I feel like I was stealing from Markiplier there. And I will see you! Okay, that's it. Goodbye!